France. March 1945. Snow still clung to the ditches, but the air already smelled of thawed earth and cordite. I lay flat beneath a shattered telegraph pole, my heartbeat synced with the slow tick of a broken watch in my pocket. Below me, a German convoy crawled through the valley of St. Aubin, trucks, one tank, and a lumbering fuel carrier, its skin glinting dull under cloud light. I steadied my rifle. The scope on top looked absurd, a tube from a broken microscope, bound with tape, copper wire for crosshairs. The squad had laughed when they saw it. No one was laughing now. 2 German mechanics stepped down from a truck to refuel. Their helmets caught the light. One spark, and the whole convoy would burn. I pressed my cheek to the stock, exhaled, and felt the wood pulse with my breath. 1 *T. Then silence. Then fire. The explosion rolled through the valley like thunder trapped in iron. In that instant, I knew I'd done the impossible. But as the smoke climbed the hill and the sound faded into wind, one thought pressed harder than the rifle's recoil. How had a repairman from Ohio ended up here, *Ner with a homemade scope, lying alone on a French hill, rewriting the rules he was supposed to follow? February 1945. The Western Front trembled after the Ardennes broke like thin ice. We pushed east with our boots still full of snowmelt and our rifles furred with frost. The men said winter would end any day. The ground said otherwise. It kept the dead and the shell fragments and the secrets, and it kept our orders, too, heavy as wet canvas. I was a private in the 9th Infantry Division, one repairman among many riflemen along the Marne. Headquarters kept the map neat with pencils and arrows. The river did not. It swelled with thaw and ran black under bridges we were told to hold. The directive was simple: advance when possible, cut the fuel lines, secure crossings before spring. Simpler still was the rule that rode every crate of ammunition and every crate of doctrine: do not alter. Issued we *P**NS. Optics, triggers, stocks, sealed by regulation and factory intention. Innovation came from above. Not from a foxhole. Not from me. They meant well, the men who wrote that. Factories had built us a war that was supposed to fit like a uniform. But the war we wore didn't match the size on the tag. Scopes fogged when the sun sank, cracked when the rifle kissed the frozen ground, and went missing when supply trucks failed to arrive. Our quartermaster kept an honest ledger of shortages. The ledger did not stop bullets. Night after night we tested the sky for bombers that never reached us and waited on artillery that sat somewhere behind ice and distance. In the woods, the wind moved through stripped branches like dry brushes over a drum. Visibility fell to a hand's breadth and then a guess. That was the real front, not a line, not a doctrine, but a corridor of uncertainty between what we could see and what we could swear to. When the platoon's last good scope lost its zero, jostled in a truck, or in a fall, or by a hand that did not admit it, we took turns pretending it was fine. We tightened rings that were already tight, breathed warm fog over the lenses to chase the colder fog within, and swore at the tiny screws as if they were listening. At 200 yards I could still place a **T where it had to go. At 4, the crosshairs wandered. At 6, the best rifle in our company became ordinary again. Men died in those missing inches. I kept a small notebook in my breast pocket, the same one where I sketched busted radio guts and gear trains back in Elmville. In it I wrote ranges, wind guesses, and notes from a manual whose certainty had gone brittle in the cold. The manual said that sighting systems were delicate, factory calibrated, and not to be opened except by Ordnance personnel. The manual did not mention the way a man stares at you when he asks if you can hit a driver before he reaches the bend. I learned which officers would look away if you fixed a thing no one had authorized. I learned which sergeants would call it clever in private and then call it foolish information. I learned that a good lie in wartime sounds like a number: we'll get you a new scope by Friday. Friday never came. The trucks came sometimes. They brought crates with other people's names on them, and food turned gray by the journey. We shared solutions like contraband. A sling made from a torn shelter half that steadied a shaking elbow. A strip of bicycle inner tube to tame the rattle in a handguard. Chalk marks on a receiver that told the truth about a bent front sight. I logged all of it and said nothing to anyone who wrote with ink. The weather turned from merciless to merely cruel. That was when the convoys began to move on the roads we could half see through thaw mist. German fuel, German bread, German courage in trucks and one or two armor shapes that bullied the rest through ruts. We were told to listen and report, to let the larger plan decide which artery to cut. But plans grow slow in winter. Engines do not. In February I repaired more radios than rifles. Our battalion net sounded like a pond full of frogs, all of them coughing. Batteries died in pockets. Antennas iced over like reeds. I cannibalized one handset to feed another and learned that the silence between bursts of static is a kind of enemy you have to fight with pliers. That month, an officer from a rear depot visited to inspect our WE*P*NS4, compliance and condition. He wore clean boots and a face that had not met wind in a while. He looked through our racks and wrote remarks. He held up a rifle with a chipped handguard as if it were a stained glass pane and said, "This is not according to specification." I watched Sergeant Malloy nod and say, "No, sir," and then watched him slide the same rifle back to the same man who needed it at dusk. The rule against modifications had a reason: bad fixes K*LL. A cracked receiver becomes shrapnel. A filed sear becomes a ghost. I respected that. I still do. But there is another rule that never makes a leaflet: bad problems K*led yesterday. What no one wrote down was the arithmetic of distance and time. If we could place one bullet into a fuel line at 600 yards, a platoon would not have to fight 300 yards closer. If we could put a driver's head down at the exact breath when his truck crested a bend, a road would become a barricade and a night would become survivable. That arithmetic did not ask for permission. It asked for sight. When the microscope tube showed up in a medical tent, cracked, left aside, its brass still intact, I felt the shift before I admitted it. The doctor said it was useless. I said nothing and cradled it like a guilty thought. My hands weighed the glass, weighed the distance to the men who would call it foolish, weighed the line in the manual that would name it a crime. Then I wrote one sentence in my notebook to see if it looked like truth on paper: "If the factory cannot see this valley, I will." From there, the system and I parted ways by a hair's breadth, thin enough to deny, thick enough to matter. The river kept running east. So did the fuel. And so did we. Before the war, I fixed radios and pocket watches in Elmville, Ohio, a place so small that when the mill whistle blew at noon, every clock in town was compared against it. My shop smelled of solder, pine oil, and patience. I kept to myself, bent over circuits and brass gears until the evening light turned the glass counter amber. I wasn't brave. I wasn't restless. I was just careful. My father used to say, "If something clicks wrong today, it'll explode tomorrow." He meant machinery. I heard prophecy. By 19 I could disassemble a Philco radio blindfolded and rethread a balance spring finer than a human hair. Customers trusted me because I didn't talk much. Machines didn't need talking, they needed listening. Every hum, every skip of a gear tooth told a story. I'd sit with a wristwatch ticking on the counter and time my breathing to its rhythm until both of us steadied. When war broke out in Europe, I marked it in my ledger like any other note: September 1, 1939, Poland invaded, client, Mr. Reeves, pocket watch repair. I didn't think it would reach us. I believed distance still meant something. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and distance collapsed into noise on every radio frequency. Men lined up at the courthouse. The factory across from my shop switched from farm tools to shell casings. Even the church bells were melted for brass. In April of '43 I received my draft notice: not a summons to fight, but to fix. The army needed technicians who could handle small instruments. My hands, trained on clock springs, were apparently fit for we*P*NS. I reported to Fort Benning, Georgia, where they gave me a rifle heavier than any machine I'd ever lifted and told me it was simple enough for a farmer. It wasn't simple. Not the we*P*N, not the discipline, not the waiting. The army tried to turn precision into obedience. I learned to strip and reassemble an M1 Garand in under a minute, blindfolded, as if speed erased doubt. But what they called discipline felt like deliberate blindness, an insistence that every problem already had a written solution, that thought itself was a form of delay. They moved me to radio maintenance when someone noticed my inspection reports were longer than orders required. I spent nights surrounded by static and tubes glowing like coals. That hum in the headset became my new heartbeat. When my unit shipped to England in late '44, I carried one suitcase, uniform, field kit, and a small box of tools. Inside were tweezers, wire, and the kind of solder that still smelled like home. We landed at Le Havre weeks after D-Day. The air there was different, metallic, damp, faintly sweet from the burned sugar of fuel depots. France in winter looked nothing like the newsreels. Fields were brown scars, trees limbless silhouettes. The war didn't occupy the landscape, it had become the landscape. Our job was to keep communication lines alive across terrain that ate everything metal. Frozen cables snapped like brittle vines. I spliced them until my fingers bled through gloves. Sometimes the signal carried voices, sometimes it carried nothing but wind that sounded almost human. I wrote home to my sister Ruth whenever we paused long enough to find paper. My letters were short and precise, like field notes. Out here, everyone's repairing themselves like busted tools. The trick is not to let a crack turn into a break. She told me later that Mother couldn't read those lines without folding the page in half. Too mechanical, she said. Too cold. But there was no other language left that felt true. In February, they reassigned me to a rifle company short on men who could handle optics. Someone thought my work with fine lenses might translate to scopes. It did, in part. What no one mentioned was that most of the scopes were broken, fogged, dented, or lost somewhere between depots. The quartermaster shrugged and said, "Make do." That was how I learned the Army's second great truth: supply lines lie, gravity doesn't. By the time we reached the Marne sector, I was officially a rifleman with unofficial responsibilities. I carried pliers in my ammo pouch and a screwdriver where a bayonet should have been. When equipment failed, the sergeant barked, "Find Coulter." I'd kneel in the mud, strip a wire, patch a field phone, or file a cracked sight until it worked just long enough to matter. The men tolerated me because their lives depended on my stubbornness. They called me Dr. Focus after I spent a night recentering a fogged scope using a stolen magnifying lens from a medical crate. The lens was part of a microscope shattered by shrapnel. The brass tube had survived. I didn't throw it away. It reminded me of home, of workbenches and small corrections no one else noticed. That winter I began to think less about survival and more about function. War, at its smallest scale, is a contest of tolerances, which machine holds a fraction longer before giving out. Every jammed bolt, every snapped spring was another equation of friction and fatigue. I learned to measure sound the way I once measured time. The click of a safety in darkness told me more than a scout's report. The way an engine coughed in the valley meant fuel shortages or bad carburation. The world spoke in mechanics, not morals. At night, under red-filtered lamps, I'd sit apart from the others and sketch small diagrams, reticle alignments, lens distances, angles of reflection. The others gambled or smoked. I soldered. Once, Sergeant Malloy caught me polishing that microscope tube. He grinned, teeth gray from rations. "You gonna cure the Krauts with that thing, Doc?" I said, "Maybe I'll see them better." He laughed and walked away. The truth was simpler: I needed something orderly in a world that wasn't. Every screw I turned tight was one less variable in chaos. When I slept, rarely, I dreamed not of battle but of calibration. The steady twist of a focus ring until the blur sharpened. The moment before clarity when everything hovered between guess and certainty. That, I think, was the moment I lived for, the half-second before the world snapped into place. I didn't know then that it would also be the half-second before I pulled a trigger that changed everything. By early March 1945, the rifles in our platoon had turned unreliable in a quiet, treacherous way, bolts sluggish from grime, scopes useless with frost between their lenses. The snipers were the worst off. Out of 7 rifles fitted for long-range fire, 3 had cracked optics, 2 had fog so dense you could see ghosts in them, and 1 had a reticle that danced freely when the trigger was pulled. Only 1 scope, by some miracle of alignment and luck, still held a 0 worth trusting. Shooting at distance became guesswork. A man could line up crosshairs on a truck door and hit a hill behind it. After a while, we stopped believing in the idea of precision. The sergeant said the same thing every time a rifle went wrong: send it back through supply. He knew as well as I did that nothing came back. I still carried the microscope tube in my pack, wrapped in cloth, a curiosity I wasn't sure I'd ever use. The glass inside was clouded at one end, clear at the other. The brass body was dented where shrapnel had grazed it, but the internal focus ring still turned smooth. It had survived more than most men. One night, we bivouacked near a ruined chapel north of the Marne. Wind cut through the open roof, whispering over the pews like breath through reeds. The squad huddled around a makeshift stove made from an artillery shell casing. I sat apart, my rifle across my knees, turning the microscope in my hands. The idea came not as inspiration but as irritation, an itch against the rules. The Army's manual forbade field modification of optical gear under threat of court-martial. No exceptions. Optics were calibrated instruments, and calibration meant factories, engineers, and instruments none of us had. But what good were regulations written under electric light to men who fought under clouds? I unscrewed the rifle's sight base and laid it beside the microscope tube. The diameters were close, not perfect, but enough to imagine a fit. I measured distance between lenses with the thin ruler I kept folded in my notebook, marked a line, and began. "Coulter," Sergeant Malloy said from across the fire, "you break that rifle and you'll answer for it." "Then I'll answer for it," I replied. He stared, then smirked. "Do it if you want, Coulter, just don't come crying when it blows up in your face." They laughed, the kind of laughter men use to make distance between themselves and trouble. I didn't join. That night, under a red-filtered lantern, I worked. I scavenged wire from a ruined field phone, twisted it into a crude reticle cross, and soldered it in place using the tip of my bayonet heated in the stove. I bound the tube to the rifle's scope mount with 2 strips of leather cut from a ruined glove, then sealed the seams with candle wax to keep out moisture. When I looked through it, the world bent strangely but clear enough to test. I sighted on the horizon, a line of trees pale under moonlight. The image was small, doubled at the edges, imperfect, but it magnified. That was enough. The men gathered to see the contraption. It looked absurd, a rifle with a medical instrument grafted to it, held together by tape, wire, and defiance. "Gentlemen," Malloy said, "behold Dr. Focus and his miracle." The name stuck. By dawn, they were calling me Mad Radio Man. The teasing didn't bother me. When everything else in the war felt beyond reason, making something functional felt like rebellion that mattered. At first light, I took the rifle outside the chapel ruins and aimed at a rusted cassette atop a fence post 100 yards away. The sh*T rang, the can fell, and silence followed. The laughter stopped. "Do it again," someone said. I did. The second can tumbled into the snow. The scope wasn't accurate, it was consistent. That was all a shooter ever needed, predictability. For days after, I adjusted it in stolen minutes, tightened a wire, ground the inner lens edge smooth with emery cloth, etched a range scale along the brass with a pencil tip. My notebook filled with notes: windage drift, parallax error, field curvature. Terms stolen from manuals I'd half read, now rewritten in the only ink available, mud and graphite. When fog rolled in, the real tests began. I could still make out silhouettes where naked eyes saw nothing. Through that fragile glass I learned to read light differently, to measure distance not in yards but in breathing space. Word spread through the platoon. Men borrowed my scope to spot targets. Some said it was witchcraft, others luck. I said nothing. Then came a reprimand. A supply officer saw me cleaning the rifle and reported the modification up the chain. 2 days later, I was summoned to the command post, a barn reeking of hay and diesel. An officer I didn't know sat behind a crate marked Ordnance, fragile. He asked if I'd tampered with government property. I said yes. He asked why. I told him, because it worked. He wrote something on a form, paused, then dismissed me without comment. I expected punishment. None came. I realized later they hadn't the time or manpower to care about one private's heresy when bridges were falling and trucks ran dry. After that, no one questioned my rifle again. Some even brought me their own to adjust. A few nights later, a corporal from another company handed me a broken scope and whispered, "Can you make it see?" I could. I did. By March, my microscope contraption had claimed its first rumor. Someone said it could hit a helmet at 500 yards. I didn't deny it. The myth helped morale, and myths travel faster than bullets. Still, I knew the truth: it wasn't a miracle of engineering. It was desperation shaped into metal. War loves rules until rules freeze. Then it remembers men like me. And somewhere ahead, across the valley of St. Aubin, a convoy moved in the fog, carrying the very fuel that kept the war breathing. My scope, ridiculous and fragile, waited for its test of faith. March 4, 1945. We woke before dawn to the sound of engines far off, deep, rhythmic, deliberate. Not tanks, heavier, slower. Fuel carriers. The kind that fed everything else. Reconnaissance had spotted them the night before, moving through the St. Aubin Valley. The valley was a shallow scar between two low ridges, its roads half-thawed and gleaming with ice. From there, the Germans could push supplies north toward what was left of their line at the Rhine. Cut that route, and we'd shorten the war by weeks. Miss it, and we'd face another counterattack by spring. The order that came down was cautious: hold position. Wait for air support. But the weather grounded every aircraft. Artillery was miles out of range. We were a handful of infantry, a broken half-track, and a prayer. I listened to the radio until the static turned to nothing. The sergeant looked at his watch, looked at the horizon, and finally said, "We're blind, and they're moving." He meant it as frustration. I heard it as permission. Through my scope, my ugly, improvised miracle, I saw the convoy clearly. One Tiger at the head, followed by trucks loaded with crates, then a single tanker in the center, larger than the rest. The driver smoked as he steered. I could almost smell it. The valley was quiet except for the low growl of engines laboring through mud. The air itself seemed to wait. My breath fogged against the scope's eyepiece, frosting the edges. I wiped it with my sleeve and kept watching. Malloy crouched beside me. "They'll hit the crossroads by dusk," he said. "If we wait for command, we'll lose the sh*T. He didn't have to say the rest. Reinforcements wouldn't reach us until morning. By then, the convoy would be across. The Germans would have fuel, firepower, and cover. I checked the wind with a torn scrap of paper. Barely a whisper. The world was giving me one still hour. Malloy muttered, "Orders say we hold." "Orders don't see what I see," I said. He didn't answer. I knew what he was thinking, that this wasn't my call, that one man with a rifle wasn't meant to start a battle. But I also knew the math. The tanker was the center of their formation, the bloodstream of the column. Hit it, and the rest would bleed out. I felt the weight of the rifle settle into my shoulder. The scope's crosshairs, thin wires from a field phone coil, trembled as I adjusted for distance. 700, maybe 8. The manual said our rifles weren't accurate past 5. Manuals are written in peace. My pulse was steady. The only sound was the tick of the damaged watch in my pocket, still running slow since November. Tick. 2 mechanics climbed down to refuel the tanker. Tick. One struck a match to light a cigarette. Tick. The decision came quietly, without heroics, the way small parts in a machine decide to move together. I'm taking the sh*T, I said. Malloy's head turned sharply. That's suicide. You'll give away our position. Maybe, I said, but they'll never reach the river. He exhaled through his nose, slow and long. If you miss, you never fired. If you hit. I didn't. He nodded once. That was our contract. I crawled forward until frost crackled under my belly. My fingers found the rifle's trigger guard, cold and slick with condensation. The crosshairs steadied over the tanker's midsection. A gust of wind brushed the grass flat, then died. The whole valley held its breath. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. Muzzle flash bloomed white. A heartbeat later, impact. A sharp, metallic crack, then the soft whump of igniting vapor. For half a second, the world stayed still. Then it erupted. Fire climbed the tanker like it had been waiting for an excuse. Pressure built in a flash, invisible, instant, and then the steel skin tore open. The explosion rolled outward, a blossom of orange and black that swallowed 2 trucks whole. The shockwave hit seconds later, slamming into the ridge. My teeth rattled. Malloy ducked, swearing. A delay, a pause, and then secondary detonations, smaller pops as crates of ammunition cooked off in the heat. Through the scope I saw men running, shadows inside light. One of them fell, another crawled, both swallowed by the inferno that had once been an organized column. The Tiger at the front reversed too quickly, treads slipping in mud, its turret swinging like a blind searchlight. The crew didn't know where the sh*T had come from. They fired into the hills, blind, their shells bursting hundreds of yards off. Malloy shouted, "You got them. You damn well got them." But I didn't move. I kept the rifle to my shoulder, watching the flames twist in the wind. The tanker's remains were unrecognizable, just a burning skeleton on wheels. The convoy scattered like insects, the road now a river of smoke and confusion. From behind us, our men began firing, rifles first, then machine G*NS. The chaos below became a rout. No coordination, no command, just instinct. I stayed prone, working the bolts slowly, mechanically. Another target, another breath. Every sh*T after the first was easier because the worst rule had already been broken. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. By the end, the valley was burning from one ridge to the other. When it was over, Malloy sat down beside me, panting. "Jesus, Coulter, you just started a battle we weren't supposed to fight." I said, "Then it's one less we'll have to." He laughed once, not out of joy, but disbelief, and then went silent. Below us, the fuel fire raged, consuming everything it touched. The smoke rose straight up, thick and black, marking our position to whoever cared to look. But no counterfire came. Nothing moved in that valley except the flames. I lowered the rifle. The improvised scope's wires glowed faintly red in the reflected light, like veins under skin. For a long time, I just stared through it at what I'd done, until the world came back in pieces, the wind, the smell, the faint ringing in my ears. That's how you know a moment is real in war, when the noise fades and what's left is the quiet that follows disobedience. We hadn't waited for orders. We hadn't asked permission. And for once, that had saved us. Night fell over the valley before the flames did. The smoke rose in slow columns, thick as poured ink, flattening against the low clouds until it looked like the sky itself had been burned hollow. Our position stank of G*N oil and thawed mud. My ears still rang. I sat behind the ridge with the rifle across my knees, its barrel cooling in the wind. The scope's wire reticle had warped slightly from the heat of the explosion, one cross strand sagged into a faint curve. I touched it with a gloved finger. It held. Malloy crouched beside me, his face a shade darker with soot. "You realize, Coulter," he said quietly, "you just broke every rule in the book." "I know. Every damn one." I nodded. "And we're still breathing." He didn't argue. We watched the convoy die in slow motion, vehicles cooking off one by one, ammunition tracing brief white arcs into the night like ghosts forgetting where to fall. No radio orders came. No reprimand. Just wind. When I finally climbed down to the base of the hill, the fire was still burning, muted now, more glow than flame. Charred fuel drums hissed in the slush. A truck wheel spun lazily in place, its axle screaming like a wounded animal. The Tiger tank had slumped into the ditch, paint bubbled off, its machine G*N drooping like a melted clock hand. I found the crater where the tanker had been hit. The earth there was black glass, smooth and rippled. It reflected the moonlight. Every footstep cracked it like thin ice. A helmet lay nearby, German, still warm from the blast. I picked it up and set it on a fence post, not from sentiment, but from habit. Machines deserved order even in ruin. Malloy joined me, his rifle slung across his back. "We'll need to report this," he said. "They'll ask who fired." "Tell them artillery," I said. He laughed once, short and bitter. "They'll believe it. Everyone believes paperwork." We returned to camp at dawn. The men looked at me differently, not with admiration, not yet, but with the wary silence soldiers give to something they can't categorize. They had seen what a single *T could do when rules stopped applying. The sergeant walked up, eyes narrowed. "That your handiwork, Coulter?" I said nothing. He held out his hand. "Let me see it." I passed him the rifle. He examined the scope, turning it over slowly. The glass was soot-stained but intact. "You really made this from a microscope?" "Yes, sir." He squinted through it, frowned, and handed it back. "Guess it's not a toy after all." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Don't lose it." That was all. No punishment, no commendation. The war had no time for either. 2 days later, I was called to headquarters. They sat me down in a drafty farmhouse that smelled of gasoline and stale coffee. 3 officers and 1 engineer from Ordnance Command waited around a table stacked with folders. The engineer's sleeves were rolled high, his hands were soft, unscarred. He began, "Private Coulter, we've been informed you used a modified optical instrument to engage an enemy convoy on March 4th. Describe this instrument." I placed the rifle on the table. The engineer leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. "You improvised a reticle using wire?" "Yes." "Alignment?" "By trial. Adjusted at 200 yards until parallax error balanced. The crosshairs flex at recoil but return true." He raised an eyebrow. "And range estimation?" I opened my notebook and slid it toward him. Inside were sketches, lens spacing, estimated magnification ratios, notations of temperature drift. My handwriting looked steadier than I felt. The officers whispered among themselves. One said, You realize unauthorized modification of We*P*N systems is a court-martial offense. Yes, sir, I answered. But artillery was out of range. Air support grounded. We were the only ones who could see the target. He stared at me for a long time, then said, "And you claim a single sh*T destroyed a convoy of fuel vehicles?" I didn't answer. They'd seen the fire. After an hour of questions, they let me go. I expected confinement. Instead, a lieutenant followed me outside. He was younger than me, his coat too clean for the field. "Off the record," he said, "what were you thinking?" "That if I missed, we'd die," I said. He smiled faintly. "Well, don't miss next time either." The next morning, something strange happened. Men who'd laughed at the scope now stood in line to look through it. They took turns sighting through the little brass tube, shaking their heads like children at a carnival. One said, "Hell, it's clearer than the ones we got." Another muttered, "Should have issued us microscopes instead." Word spread quietly, traveling faster than orders ever did. Someone from another unit came by, asked if I could show their marksman how I'd built it. I told him no, not because I was protecting it, but because I didn't remember every step anymore. Half of it had been instinct. Half of it had been need. A captain from the 9th Division stopped me that evening. "You did the impossible with what you had," he said. "That's the only kind of miracle we trust out here." By then, the official report had already rewritten the story. Headquarters credited the St. Aubin explosion to a long-range artillery strike, caliber unknown. It made sense on paper, and paper is what wars are archived on. No mention of one rifle, one scope, or one man who didn't wait for permission. But in the days that followed, I saw more rifles wearing strange attachments, binocular lenses taped to stocks, cracked scopes patched with wax and prayer. Every man wanted a little piece of what had happened on that hill. The army didn't issue innovation. It borrowed it from desperation. When I cleaned my rifle that night, I noticed the wire crosshair had loosened again. I tightened it carefully, breathing slow, the way I used to over a clock's escapement. Somewhere outside, artillery muttered like distant thunder. I thought of home, of my shop in Elmville, and of how my father used to say machines told you the truth if you listened long enough. I wondered what truth this one would tell when the war finally went silent. The wind through the broken shutters answered for it, low, steady, and almost human. The war ended quietly for us. No last charge, no trumpet, no flag over ruins. Just a silence that lasted too long to be trusted. The fire in the St. Aubin Valley smoldered for days, visible even from our next position miles east. Someone said it burned through the fuel lines all the way to a storage depot, crippling a retreating German regiment. No report confirmed it. Some stories survive better when they aren't written down. 2 weeks later, our unit was pulled back toward the Rhine. The sky began to thaw into a tired spring. Mud replaced frost, and we marched ankle-deep in it. The smell of cordite faded, replaced by wet grass and dead leaves. It was over. At least that's what the officers said. I carried the rifle slung over my shoulder, the microscope scope still taped in place. The leather straps had darkened with oil, the glass scratched by grit. It looked worse than ever, like a relic of a war that had devoured its own manuals. When we reached a captured village near Bonn, I was told to report to division headquarters. The sergeant handed me the order slip and said, "Don't worry, document. They're not hanging anyone this late in the war." The headquarters was a schoolhouse converted into a command post. Maps hung over chalkboards. Children's desks were stacked in corners beside ammo crates. Inside one of the classrooms, a group of officers sat behind a long table. Their uniforms were pressed, their pens full of ink. The same questions came again: how I'd built the scope, what materials I'd used, whether it could be replicated. They spoke in clipped tones, avoiding words like disobedience or luck. I gave them the only answers I had: solder, glass, wire, patience. They took the rifle, photographed it from every angle, then placed it carefully into a wooden crate labeled property of U.S. Ordnance Department. I signed a form I couldn't read through the carbon smudge. One officer said, "Your We*P*N will be evaluated for potential training reference." That was the closest thing to recognition I would ever receive. When I left the schoolhouse, the afternoon sun glared off the river. Children, German, barefoot, ghostly thin, watched from doorways as we passed. A boy pointed at the insignia on my sleeve and whispered something to his mother. I pretended not to hear. By May, the shooting had stopped everywhere. The world began collecting itself piece by piece, as if unsure of its shape. The army kept us busy cataloging equipment, burning documents, dismantling field radios. War loves order when it's finished making chaos. I wrote one last letter to Ruth. They say peace has weight too. You can feel it on your shoulders the same way you feel a pack, only lighter but stranger. I think I missed the sound of things breaking because it told me they still worked. When the transport ship carried us home that summer, the ocean looked unreal, too wide, too clean. I stood at the rail and tried to remember the smell of machine oil. It already felt like a different life. Elmville hadn't changed much. The mill still blew its noon whistle. My shop's windows were dusty but intact. I unlocked the door, swept the floor, and hung the old sign back up: Coulter Repairs, watches, radios, precision work. The first job I took was fixing a pocket watch cracked from age. The second was rewiring a tractor ignition. Each sound of metal on metal felt like a translation from one world into another. I kept the uniform folded in the attic, the medals, none of them mine, in a drawer. For years, I didn't speak of St. Aubin. When people asked, I said I'd been an ordinary rifleman, which was true in every way that mattered. 20 years passed. Then one morning, a letter arrived from a museum in Washington. They'd received a crate from the Ordnance archives marked Improvised Optical Device, 1945. Inside, they'd found my scope. Someone had traced the paperwork back to me. They wanted to display it. I went. The museum smelled like polish and climate control. Behind the glass, my crude contraption looked smaller than I remembered, fragile, almost toy-like. The brass had dulled to a soft green. A placard beneath it read, "Improvised sniper scope built from a field microscope. Used by Private Thomas Coulter, 9th Infantry Division, March 1945. Credited with disabling a German convoy near St. Aubin." That was all. No mention of disobedience. No mention of how close it had come to being court-martial evidence instead of an exhibit. A curator, gray-haired and polite, asked if I wanted to hold it one last time. I declined. Some tools belong to their moment, take them out of it, and they're just metal again. He asked if the story was true, if it had really worked. I said yes, though what I meant was it had worked once, and that was enough. Afterward, I walked out into the city evening. Traffic hummed. Neon reflected off wet pavement like tracer fire in slow motion. The world had changed its machinery but not its noise. In the years that followed, I heard whispers that the Army had *N including a new section in its training manuals, lessons on improvisation, field adaptation, independent judgment. They called it Adaptive *Nary Doctrine. No one credited a name. They never do. But when I read the line that said, "Use what you have, see what others cannot," I recognized the ghost of my handwriting. Sometimes I think about that night in the valley, the spark, the fire, the way silence returned afterward. It wasn't heroism. It was just refusal. Refusal to let rules outlive reason. I kept the habits but not the rifle. I still calibrate everything: the tick of a clock, the hum of a motor, the distance between what I'm told and what I know. If the scope taught me anything, it's that clarity comes when you build it yourself. And if history forgets the name, maybe that's fair. A machine doesn't remember who made it work, it only remembers that it did. Sometimes at night, when the clocks in my shop all tick out of sync, I remember the sound of that first explosion rolling through the St. Aubin Valley. The way the earth breathed fire and smoke in the same second. The way silence fell after, clean as frost. People call what happened that day an act of luck, or invention, or defiance. But I know it wasn't any of those. It was arithmetic, the kind that weighs one choice against another until something breaks. The sum of all the hours spent listening to broken gears and whispering signals through static. They say soldiers win wars. That's only half of it. Wars are really decided by the men who know when a rule no longer applies. I was never a hero. I was a man who saw what the book didn't cover and decided to look anyway. The museum plaque uses neat words, improvised sniper scope. Unofficial we*P*N modification. It never mentions fear, or the way my hands shook while I wrapped that last piece of wire. It doesn't mention that, in the weeks after, I couldn't sleep without hearing the metallic click of the trigger in my head, over and over, like a watch winding down. In Elmville, the nights are quiet. When the wind blows, it slips through the power lines outside my shop with the same low hum as a field radio. I listen to it sometimes, wondering what frequency I'd tune to if I still had that set. Maybe the past still broadcasts, faint but steady, waiting for someone to pick it up. I've kept the habits of precision. Every morning, I check the timing of each clock in the window. If one runs fast, I open its case and adjust the escapement by a fraction of a millimeter. Small corrections, always small. The difference between error and order is never more than a hair's breadth. Once, a boy came in to have his wristwatch repaired. He couldn't have been more than 12. He asked about the photograph behind my counter, the one the curator mailed me after the exhibit opened. In it, the rifle lies behind glass, the scope gleaming faintly under the display lights. He said, "Did you really make that?" I told him yes. He looked impressed in the way only children can be. "Did it work?" "It worked once," I said. "That's all a machine has to do." He didn't understand, not yet. I didn't explain. After he left, I wound the shop clock and thought about all the other inventions born from fear, field fixes, battlefield miracles, things the manuals never mentioned. Somewhere, I imagined, another soldier was breaking another rule to save his own. That's how progress happens, quietly, out of sight, under duress. The army never sent a medal. I'm grateful. A medal would have meant they'd understood, and they didn't. They turned the lesson into doctrine, stripped of its weight. That's how institutions survive their own contradictions. But sometimes, when I read an old field manual and see the phrase, initiative under duress, I know someone, somewhere, kept a note alive. Maybe one of the officers who questioned me. Maybe Malloy, if he made it home. Maybe none of them. It doesn't matter. The truth is simpler than the stories they tell. On that hill above St. Aubin, I wasn't brave. I was afraid that if I did nothing, the world would stay broken. Fear isn't weakness. It's just the first jolt that makes a mechanism move. Years after the war, I was invited back to speak at a training seminar for Ordnance engineers. I almost refused. But curiosity won. The auditorium was filled with young men in clean uniforms, their notebooks already half full before I said a word. They asked me how I'd calculated the range that day, how I'd balanced the scope's drift, how I'd known the sh*T would hit. I didn't, I told them. I just made the problem small enough to solve. They waited for more, for some grand statement about courage or duty. I said nothing else. They applauded anyway. When I stepped outside afterward, the air smelled of oil and rain. A generation that hadn't heard artillery thunder didn't know how lucky it was. I walked away before they could ask for photographs. Back in Elmville, I still keep the letter the museum sent me, creased, faded, the ink turned brown at the edges. Sometimes I read it aloud to myself, not for pride, but as proof that the thing once existed outside memory. At the bottom, below the curator's signature, there's a single sentence written in pencil. "You did the impossible with what you had." I never knew if he wrote it for me or for the artifact. Maybe it doesn't matter. Now, when customers bring in broken clocks, I see the same truth in every gear and spring: nothing ever works the way it's designed to. You learn to work with what remains. The Valley of St. Aubin is grass now. I saw a photograph in a magazine once: green hills, a road rebuilt where the convoy burned. No sign of war, no scar except the one the camera couldn't see. That's how history repairs itself: it replaces evidence with distance. I close the shop most nights around 10. The air cools, the ticking slows, and for a few minutes, everything runs perfectly in time. I stand by the window and watch the street lamps buzz to life, their filaments glowing like embers. If someone asked me what I learned from all of it, I'd say this: rules are meant for peace. In war, survival writes its own instructions. And sometimes, one man with a cracked scope and a steady breath can change the shape of a valley. They laughed at my homemade site once. But laughter doesn't last. Light does. I see it every evening reflected in the glass, the same dull shine as that brass tube. The DIY scope that turned a regular G***ner into a legend. It wasn't the rifle that mattered. It was the moment when I stopped waiting for permission to see. It's strange, the way memory works after 50 years. The mind keeps the heat, not the fire, the silence, not the sound. When I close my eyes, I still see the valley: flat light, slow smoke, snow melting around the edges of craters. I can count the seconds between the **T and the blast, but I can't recall the faces of the men beside me. Maybe that's mercy. Maybe it's how the brain protects what's left of itself. People come into the shop sometimes and want to talk about the war. Not the real war, the one in their heads, made of photographs and old film reels. They say words like hero and legend. I let them. They need those words more than I do. But there's nothing heroic about disobedience that happens because logic leaves you no other road. It's just reaction, shaped by hours, rules, and fear compressed into one instant. Once, a journalist came from Chicago. Said he was writing about wartime innovation, how soldiers had invented things in the field. He'd heard about the microscope scope and wanted to see me. He asked questions as if history were a machine he could fix with enough details. "What were you thinking when you pulled the trigger?" he asked. "I wasn't," I said. "Thinking slows you down." He waited, pen trembling above his notebook. "But you must have known it would change things." "No," I said. "I just knew the alternative." He wrote that down, then left disappointed. The story he printed later was called The Man Who Aimed at History. I clipped it and stored it in a drawer I never open. He'd written that I broke orders to prove a point. But there was no point to prove, only a convoy that needed stopping. After he left, I spent that evening rewinding clocks. The steady click of gears always brings me back. When a mechanism runs too fast, it wears itself out. That's what war does to men: it makes them spin faster than they were designed to. You survive by learning when to slow the motion down. I sometimes dream of the rifle, how heavy it felt, how the leather strap cut into my palm when I carried it. In the dream, I always find it again, wrapped in burlap in some forgotten attic, as if waiting for me to take another **T. But when I lift it, there's no scope. Just an empty mount and a reflection of my own face in the receiver. Then I wake up to the tick of the regulator clock and the smell of oil. The world has turned digital now. Precision is measured in code instead of touch. They say no one needs to feel machines anymore. But I still trust the weight of things, the drag of a screw under the hand. That's how you know it's real. Last winter, I visited the museum again. The scope had been moved to a smaller display, tucked between a flare G*N and a field compass. The curator was different this time, a young woman, polite, efficient. She said visitor interest had dwindled. History cycles, she explained. Every generation finds new miracles to remember. I looked at the glass case. Dust had gathered at the edges. The label was yellowing. I thought of how long it had taken me to build the thing, 3 nights of soldering by lantern light, each moment stolen from sleep. Now it was an artifact, a relic of necessity. Do you ever think, she asked, that what you did was the beginning of modern field improvisation? No, I said. It was the end of patience. She smiled like she thought it was a joke. Maybe it was. Outside, the city was loud, cars, sirens, people moving fast. The noise felt familiar, the same rhythm as artillery years ago. Civilization and chaos used the same tempo. I walked past shop windows glowing with televisions showing another war somewhere else. Different uniforms, same expressions. I thought about the men on those screens, young and certain, still believing that the rules will hold until they don't. Someone among them will break one someday for the same reason I did. That's how survival renews itself. When I got home, I opened the drawer with the newspaper clipping and the old letters. Among them lay the small pocket watch I'd carried in France. It still runs, slower now, losing a minute every few days. I never fixed it. Some flaws are worth keeping, they remind you that even precision has limits. I wound it once, listened to the faint tick, and realized it sounded almost like the trigger of the rifle. A small sound that changes everything. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the men from my unit. Malloy, the sergeant, the radio operator who called me Dr. Focus. I've tried to find them, but records are thin. Maybe they're gone. Maybe they sit somewhere like I do, watching light fade across a workbench and thinking about the rules they bent just enough to live another day. If I could speak to them again, I'd say, we weren't wrong. We were necessary. That's the difference between rule and reason. A rule ends where its author stops imagining. Reason keeps going. Now, when I lock the shop each night, I look at the reflection in the glass door, an old man framed by clocks and radios, the last fragments of a world that once depended on steady hands. Behind me, the second hands move together for a moment, a perfect chorus before drifting apart again. That's how I remember the war, one instant of alignment, then scatter. **T, a spark, a valley of flame. Then years of quiet correction. And if anyone asks, I tell them what I told the reporter, what I told the soldiers who came after. I didn't break a rule. I replaced it. Because rules tell you how to aim. Instinct tells you when. And that, not the rifle, not the scope, not even the **T, is what saved us all. I keep the watch near the window. At dawn, sunlight hits its cracked face, and for a second the glass glows the same color as the scope once did. I tap it, hear the faint tick resume, and know that somewhere inside those gears is every lesson I ever learned. Precision isn't about perfection, it's about correction. The same way a soldier adjusts windage, or a mechanic tunes an engine by ear. The world drifts, we bring it back, one turn at a time. If they ever ask again what made me pull that trigger, I'll tell them the truth, nothing noble, nothing planned. Just the certainty that delay *LLS faster than bullets. War ends, but its logic doesn't. Somewhere, another man is staring through fogged glass, deciding whether to wait or to act. I hope he acts. Because the rule will always say, hold fire. And the world will always need someone willing to see.